Hello everyone, welcome to today's Feminist Macroeconomics Modeling and Simulation session. I'm Cem Oyvat from University of Greenwich. I'm a senior lecturer in economics in University of Greenwich. I'm an economist who's mainly working on different aspects of income distribution, both in the developed and developing countries. This includes the impact of income distribution on migration, the impact of this income distribution on growth. But lately, I'm more the roots of income distribution, but lately I've been more working on the gender macroeconomics and the impact of gender inequalities on growth and employment, and the impact of different policies that would reduce the gender inequalities. So let me share my screen. Let's review what we are going to do in this session. Here's my university, University of Greenwich in London. Okay. So this lecture will focus on the gender macroeconomic models. It will provide an overview of gender macroeconomic models with a focus on feminist post-Kaleckian macroeconomic models. I'll get back to that. I'll explain what this post-Kaleckian, post-Keynesian means and what makes a model post-Kaleckian. We are going to check specifically on the focus, we're going to focus specifically on gender wage gaps. And what would gender wage gaps, what would closing gender wage gaps lead to? And the impact of fiscal policies. Specifically, we'll focus on social infrastructure investments. I'm going to explain what we mean by social infrastructure investments and why this is relevant for our topic. And we will focus on some empirical results later, and we'll try to understand how we can simulate these models, because the models itself, of course, doesn't give anything about the magnitude of the terms. It just gives some channels, some mechanisms. So to be able to simulate these models, we need to estimate parameters, basically. I'll discuss how we could do that. Okay, when we look at the feminist post-Kaleckian models, I mean, we could say, tell these under umbrella of feminist post-Kaleckian, post-Keynesian structural macroeconomic models. What's different? I mean, why do we need to care about these models? Well, first of all, there are different models that started in 1990s. First, the earlier models of Ertürk and Çağatay checks the impact of feminization of labor. So how would the growth be affected if greater women participate in labor markets? That was the aim of the earlier models. Later, with more in line with post-Kaleckian, post-Keynesian models, people started to understand the economy as profit earners who are capitalists, female workers who earn female wages, and male workers who earn male wages. And the shares of female and male wages might matter for the patterns of growth. Well, in different studies, I mean, some studies basically look at the impact of changing ratio between female and male wages. Some studies basically look at the impact of changing income share or wage share of female workers and male workers. But the overall idea here is examining the macroeconomic effects of the change of distribution between capitalists, which usually is taken as genderless, which is of course open to discussion too, and female and male workers. A couple of studies that does this is Blacker and Seguino had an earlier article on 2020. There are some studies of Stefan Seguino from like 2010. There's a feminist economics article of Bronstein, Stever and Tavani from 2011, and lately me and Özlem Onar and Fotopoulou have several articles examining the impact of reducing gender income inequalities. And there's an article of Eckhart Hein too, that's a bit similar to the work that we are doing. In terms of the behavior of female and male workers, why would this matter? One reason is the consumption behavior of female and male workers might be different. Indeed, there's a lot of empirical studies that's showing, for instance, a larger share of women's income compared to men. It would actually increase spending on needs of household, children's education, and well-being. So the marginal propensity to consume for these items is higher for women, which might have different effects over the long run. It might have positive effects, for instance, or in terms of productivity. And overall, the marginal propensity to consume for male and female workers differ, which means that closing gender pay gaps might have, or let's say increasing wages through increasing female wages rather than male wages might have a different effect on aggregate demand or growth. Well, here, of course, the issue that I will explain later in this lecture is increasing female income is by keeping male wages has different effects compared to reducing male wages by keeping female income constant. Because you could reduce the gender pay gaps in both ways, right? I mean, you either like increase female income or you could reduce male income. But these two policies will have different effects, which we will discuss later. Another thing that these models check is the impact of unpaid and paid care work. Of course, in feminist literature, care work is very important because care is a thing that's usually done by women in the household, or greater share of care responsibility is usually on women in most countries. Which means that the care work might be a burden on female participation of labor. This is important. But another thing that's important is that the care work, both paid care work or unpaid care work, is important for productivity of the society, because after all, care work contributes human capital or education. So this basically means that like a care work has positive effects on productivity and human capital, which might have positive effects on growth over the future. Another thing that's very important is, which we focus this as by using a more broader category, like say, okay, let's say along with care, child care, elderly care, but also education and healthcare is important because these sectors employ female workers much more than male workers, or at least compared to other sectors, the education, healthcare, childcare, elderly care sector, which from now on I will call social sector, has a greater share of female employment. Here I'll give some evidence for this from more different papers. This is the share of employment in social sector, education, healthcare, elderly care, and childcare again, and the rest of the economy in the UK. So this, you have to check the axis at the right, and this is a share. This is the share of female workers in the rest of the economy in the UK over time. As you could see, it's around 40%, 60% of the work is done by male workers. But if you look at the share of female workers in the social sector, it's almost like 75% over time. These are hourly employment. In terms of wages, which you have to look at the wage gap, for the wage gap, the left, you could see that there's a gender wage gap in the UK that's very significant. But it exists in both sectors, basically. This gender pay gaps might be due to occupational segregation, which means male workers taking up managerial positions, for instance, and female workers taking more lower positions, which this is like a behavior that we see a lot. For instance, in the board of directors in Korea, there's only 2% of women that are included in board of directors in public and private companies. Another reason is, of course, for the same job, a woman might be paid less, which is an important reason for gender pay gaps. And if you look at, for instance, the female share of employment and gender pay gaps in social sector and in the rest of the economy, this is for non-agricultural sectors in developing economies. You could see that in all the developing economies, the social sector has much greater share of female employment. On average, it's almost double of female employment, like around like 60%, 62% on average are female in social sector, and this is only 30% in the rest of the economy, in the developing economies. And as you might notice, in almost all the countries, there are few exceptions like Cote d'Ivoire, Pakistan, where in the social sector, there's still greater share of male employment. But even in those countries, as you could see, relatively, in Saudi Arabia too, the social sector's share is greater than the rest of the economy. When we look at the gender pay gaps, usually you could see that, or gender pay ratios, average male wage and average female wage, we could see that there's gender pay gap in almost all countries. If you look at another thing from South Korea, we could see, for instance, in different sectors, on average, especially lately, we could see that education, healthcare, social work, which includes childcare and elderly care, there's greater share of female employment compared to most sectors. In 70s, there was greater share of female employment in 70s, 80s in food, beverages, tobacco, textiles, leather, food sector. But this also changed over time. Lately, there's still the greatest share of female employment compared to any other sector in Korea is education, healthcare, and social work, what we call the social sector. There are other models, there are more mainstream models, which we will not focus in this session, because in this session we'll more focus on the heterodox feminist macroeconomic models. But there are other a model that's looking at the supply side effects of gender inequality, intra-household bargaining on fertility, savings of the household, accumulation of human capital by using endogenous growth models, by using overlapping generations models. But we won't focus on these for this session. But before starting, or post-Kaleckian, post-Keynesian feminist macroeconomic framework, I should first teach what post-Kaleckian and post-Keynesian macro models are, I think. So these models started with few papers, like the earliest papers are Baduri and Marklin, 1990. There's also a paper of Robert Blacker from 1989, which there's also like earlier models too, but these two papers are quite influential on developing the literature. And how the Baduri-Marklin model, for instance, is that it sees that in the economy, income is shared by capitalists who earn profits and workers who earn wages. And the share of profits, which is defined as profits over GDP, is called the profit share. And the share of wages, which is defined as total wages over GDP, is here, they're called wage share. And the profit share and wage share add up to 1, okay? So in an economy, the income either goes to wage workers or capitalists. Of course, these wage shares later are being adjusted in reality for self-employed too. And there are, of course, other incomes like, for instance, interest, rent incomes. And these are usually assumed to be under the umbrella of profit share. And in the Baduri-Marklin model, if greater profit share leads to positive growth, increases the growth, if increase in profit share increases the growth regime is called profit-led. And if increase in profit share leads to decreases economic growth, the growth regime is called wage-led. And why there could be different regime types? Well, in the model, there might be, according to Baduri-Marklin, increasing profit share might create incentives for capitalists to invest. So if the capitalists know that they'll have greater profit share, they're likely to invest, which will push the capital accumulation. Also, if profit shares are increasing due to lowering unit labor costs, this might have positive effect on net exports too. But on the other hand, if profit share reduces capacity utilization, reduces temporarily the consumption demand. And why would that happen? Because the marginal propensity to consume for wage workers is higher than capitalists. Just to give an example, if you give $100 to Bill Gates, he will probably save most of this money, maybe save 95% of this money. But if you give it to someone living in the streets, this person definitely have needs. Maybe he needs to get clothes, he needs to get food. So that $100 will basically be entirely consumed by that person. So the marginal propensity to consume declines with higher incomes. This is a very Keynesian argument. And if you look for, or another example, if there's somebody like earning minimum wage, if you give an extra $100, that person probably have a lot of needs to and consume most of its income. And if there's income, the effect coming through for instance, if rising profit share reduces capacity utilization, that might have negative effects in terms of growth. Okay, well, another thing is, well, this approach has been extended for empirical purposes, which is called, which I call the GDP decomposition approach. So what people did in many different work is they examined the impact of wage share on components of GDP, or the impact of consumption, wage share on consumption, the impact of wage share on investment, and the impact of wage share on net exports are being examined separately by empirical estimations. The idea here is that, as I explained, the higher wage share might push consumption because the marginal propensity to consume is larger for workers. The wage share might have negative effect on investment by discouraging investments. But of course, if the effect coming from consumption is sufficiently large on output, the increase in wage share might increase investments too, because the output, higher output, higher economic activity also encourages investments. And if wage shares are increasing through higher unit labor costs, that might have a negative impact on net exports by reducing the export competitiveness. So we basically have wage share affecting aggregate demands, which we call the profit-led regime. And if wage share is affecting aggregate demand positively, we call this wage-led regime. Notice that it's slightly different from the Baudry-Marglin, in which in Baudry-Marglin, they were defining the growth regimes based on profit shares income on growth. And here, rather than growth, these people are examining the impact of wage share on aggregate demand, so on GDP, basically, on the levels. One example of how this is being done is if there's an increase of 1% in profit share, as we could see in Onar and Galanis, there's effects on consumption, investment, and net exports that are being examined. And you could see that according to the estimations, like in all the countries that they checked, increase in profit share has negative effects. Increase in profit share has either zero or positive effect on investment and net exports. Okay, so based on this, we basically, with Özlem Onar and Evrediki Fotopoulou, and we did a bunch of work for developing a post-Kaleckian feminist model. And what's different in here? First of all, we say that, okay, there are profit earners and wage earners, but the wages go to male and female workers. So if you look at the GDP, the income is shared by the wage bill of male workers, wage bill of female workers, and profits. R is profits in here. The wage bill of female workers is the total wages paid in social sector and the rest of the economy. So we have a social sector, which from now on I'll call with H. When you see H, this refers to social sector, and the rest of the economy, which we call physical sector, which is N. So if you see N in the model, you'll basically understand it's a physical sector. There is also unpaid domestic care sector too, that we will discuss, but in the empirical estimations, it will not have an effect. But we also wanted to consider the mechanism coming from the unpaid domestic care sector. Since we are building a feminist macroeconomic model, we didn't want to dismiss that. And if you look at the wage bill, W is wage, E is employment, and this is, for instance, the female wages. F refers to female and M refers to male. And female wages in a social sector is this. This is the average female wages. And the hourly employment in social sector is EHF. T refers to current time, which is also important because we will check the longer run effects of shocks too. So as you could see, the total wage bill for female workers is sum of social sector wage bill and rest of the economy's wage bill. That goes to female wages, and same stands for male workers. Well, we define a consumption function where the consumption in the rest of the economy, first of all, we defined, and we see that there's like it's sum of the profits after taxes. This TR is like taxes on profits. Total wage bill of female workers after taxes. This is tax taken from female workers, and total male wage bill and reduced by the taxes basically gives the consumption function. There's non-linearities here. In empirical estimations that people have done, actually the estimations come much more significant, much more relevant when people consider the logs. And this might be due to changing marginal propensity to consume, maybe with higher incomes. And when we examine the, and we also have a similar function for private expenditures in social sectors, or private expenditures in education, healthcare, social care, and elderly care, which we assume that the private expenditures in social sector is going to private sector. And we also assume that there's also separately a public expenditures on social sector. There's a private investment function that we defined, which we say, okay, the profit share, which we define as pi after taxes, affects investment, and the output affects investment too. And we say that the public debt over GDP might affect investment. This we are considering crowding out effects, because higher public debt over GDP might lead to greater interest rates, greater constraints on access to credits, which might have negative effects on private investment. And profit share is defined as the income in the rest of the economy minus the total wage payments in the rest of the economy that goes to female and male workers over the output in the rest of the economy, basically. So if there is like an increase in wages for both for female and male, this is going to have an effect on profit shares negatively. But if there's an increase in productivity, for instance, this will increase profit shares for, if, of course, for constant wages. If there's an increase in productivity, this is going to increase profit shares. Well, we defined in our works 3 types of government spending: social infrastructure, which again includes education, healthcare, social care, and elderly care; physical infrastructure investments, and other government consumptions are defined, and they are basically taken as shares of GDP. And there is a debt function that's based on the debt in the previous year, the government expenditures minus the taxes collected. So this is public debt. In terms of the demand side, we also have exports and imports equations. We said that, okay, higher profit share is happening with reduction in unit labor costs, which basically would affect export competitiveness positively. So higher profit share we consider might increase the exports, which we define with X over here. This is the export function. The demand in the rest of the world would affect exports positively, and exchange rates would affect exports. And in terms of the imports, which is this function, well, if there's, of course, greater output, this would stimulate the imports positively. This is the output in the rest of the economy rather than social sector. If there's an increase in profit shares happening with real unit labor costs, or nominal unit labor costs, this also would reduce imports because the companies also gain competitiveness against imported products. So the local companies that are gaining competitiveness against imported products. So higher profit share would also reduce imports. So overall higher profit share, we assume, would have a positive effect on net exports over the short run, of course. So another thing is we define the unpaid domestic care sector, which is function of the sum of expenditures, of consumption expenditures of made in social sector and public social infrastructure expenditures. Sum over the number of individuals in the society. This N represents the number of individuals in the society. It basically explains the unpaid care, total unpaid domestic care over number of individuals in the society. So basically, the per capita social expenditures explain the per capita unpaid care. If there's an increase here, for instance, if elderly care, child care responsibilities are taken by paid social sector, this we assume will reduce the unpaid domestic care. This unpaid domestic care is shared between male and female, and in the extreme gender inequality, this will be zero, so there won't be any public unpaid domestic care of male. All the domestic unpaid care will be done by female workers. We also defined the productivity equation here, which we, in the empirical part, we define as output over labor. We say that this is partially to make the model simpler, but partially because the effects of some of these effects that we are talking about will come as lagged effects on productivity. We say that, okay, productivity is dependent on lagged effects of different impacts of government expenditures. This includes public social expenditures and other public expenditures. There's an effect of output too. This is something that's mentioned in post-Keynesian, post-Kaleckian literature, saying that if there is higher output, this would lead to increasing returns to scale. People will benefit from increasing returns to scale, which would affect productivity. So there's an effect of output through that. There's an effect of wages, because if wages increase, the capitalists might tend to switch to labor-saving technologies. And this is actually something that might be happening if you read the news in today's United States. While the wages are slowly rising, this is also pushing productivity too, through encouraging enterprises to switch to labor-saving technologies. And there's also this efficiency wages argument, of course, in New Keynesian literature, which basically says the rising wages would increase the effort, motivation of workers and push the productivity to higher levels. We say that there will be effects of like consumption in the social sector, and there will be effects of unpaid care work on productivity that are positive. The employment, we checked both employment of female and male in N sector, rest of the economy, and social sector, H sector too. In the rest of the economy, the employment is determined basically by the output in that sector over productivity. Okay, and part of this total employment is taken by female, part of it is taken by male workers. So beta N share is taken by female workers, and 1 minus beta N share is taken by male workers. And in terms of the social employment in the social sector, it's determined by the wages paid in the social sector and the share of GDP that goes to the public social expenditures. And we say here, like when we say social sector here, for simplicity, we refer to public social sector rather than private. Okay, after refining this model, after solving this model, what we do is we examine the impact of different shocks. For instance, increasing wage rates through closing gender pay gaps. We examine the impact of public social expenditures and compare it with other public expenditures, physical infrastructure expenditures, which might be, for instance, green expenditures. And we basically, okay, how we solve the model is we basically find the impact of, for instance, if we are looking at the effects of closing gender pay gap by rising female wages. Again, this rising female wages part is important because, as I said, closing gender pay gaps by rising female wages and reducing female wages have different effects on aggregate output. And we basically examine the impact of rising female wages for each component of outputs. I'm not going to show you all the details of these equations, but one by one we examine the effects. And we also examine the impact of the output on different components of GDP, which will give us the multiplier effect. Well, when we look at the medium run effect of closing gender pay gap, we this time examine the impact of a period before wages on current consumption, investment, and net exports. And there will be multiplier effect, basically. Well, if you, for instance, look at the paper, this is from a different paper. From the paper that we shared, you could see that there's a lot of work that's being done to solve the model. So we basically one by one examine the impact of these. We find the impact on the multiplier. We find the impact on investment, consumption, and exports and imports. I won't focus too much on each of the equations due to time constraints, but I just wanted to show how it looks like in the paper. I'll look at here more simpler version of the paper too, which we don't include well if we have time left, I could go over how we could integrate wealth too. The paper that we assigned for this session was a working paper, which was a published version in Greenwich Political Economy papers. But what we are going to check is our forthcoming article in Feminist Economics with Özlem Onaran and Federico Fotopoulou, which is simpler, which we don't include wealth. Okay, so here, when we look at the impacts, we define different regimes of rising female wages in the sector and the rest of the economy with declining gender pay gap. For instance, if we say there's like a positive effect, again, similar to post-Kaleckian models of rising female wages on total consumption, since we say the margin propensity to consume of female workers are greater than the margin propensity to consume for profit earners. And this impact is slightly bigger than the impact on investment. And if it's bigger than the negative impact of rising female wages on investment and net exports, and these are like the partial impacts by keeping the output constant for now. This regime is called the female-led, gender equality-led in the short run, okay? We call this female wage-led and gender equality-led regime, and we emphasize the short run because over the long run there might be different effects. If there is a decline in female wages, that would increase aggregate output, or if the rising female wages reduce aggregate output, we call this regime gender equality-led regime. And since it's happening in the short run, gender equality-led in the short run is the name of the growth regime. And here, we could see that the condition for this is the negative impact of rising female wages on investment and net exports is greater than the positive impact on consumption. But over the long run, the story is a bit getting complicated. If rising female wages increase aggregate output in the medium run, we call this regime female wage-led or gender equality regime in the medium run. This is the name of the demand regime. Actually, it's more appropriate to call this demand regime because we are looking at the impact on the aggregate demand. And if rising female wages reduce aggregate output in the medium run, we call this gender equality-led in the medium run. This is the name of the demand regime. The effects are a bit ambiguous because the effects over the long run will come through labor productivity. Rising female wages might push for labor-saving technologies. Also, in the might push labor-saving technologies. Also, if in the short run female wage just push aggregate demand, that would have an impact of labor productivity too in the medium run. So the effects are a bit ambiguous. I mean, it's basically depending on the interaction between the demand in the previous period and the impact of wages on profit share in the next period. And this changes in profit share would, of course, affect, according to model, all components of GDP. And we say that different regimes are possible. We could have this regime, these regimes are more likely, economy is more likely to be both wage-led and female wage-led in the short run, and gender equality and profit-led, gender inequality and profit-led regime, or gender inequality or profit-led regime in the short run. But there might be different depending on the conditions. We could have, for instance, profit-led regime that might be female wage-led regime too. It's less likely, but if, for instance, increasing average wages reduces aggregate demand, and if only increasing female wages increases aggregate demand, then we would have a regime like this that falls in here. How could that happen? Well, probably the marginal propensity to consume of female workers should be much higher than the marginal propensity to consume for male workers. In the medium run, as I said, the effect of female wages are happening through labor productivity. We say that higher female wages would have positive effect on labor productivity, but it might have an effect on aggregate output in the short run, either positive or negative, and depending on the size of this, we say higher or lower aggregate output would affect public social expenditures and public physical expenditures, since the parameter that we are changing is the share of public social expenditures rather than the total public social expenditures, where we decide that we frame the model in the way that the government decides on the share of public social expenditures in GDP. So rising GDP would affect the government expenditures. Aggregate output also increases the consumption in the social sector, in the private social sector, which would have positive effects on labor productivity. Well, there's, as you could see, domestic care sector too, which the impact of rising consumption and age and public social expenditures might reduce the need for public domestic care, which might have through that negative effect on labor productivity. But we consider that, we think that, increasing public and private paid social expenditures, even though it would have slight negative effect on unpaid care sector, overall the effect of these three would be positive on labor productivity. In terms of the employment, we say since labor productivity is influenced in the next period, at first the female wages only have an effect on employment through aggregate output, but over the next period, female wages would push labor productivity and would have an effect on aggregate output. And some of these two effects, the effect coming through labor productivity and aggregate output, would give us the changes in employment in the next period. If the effects on aggregate output are positive and greater than labor productivity, then higher female wages will lead to increasing employment in the next period. But if the impact of higher female wages on aggregate output are negative, and labor productivity will be influenced positively by higher female wages through efficiency wages and labor saving techniques adopted, it will have a negative impact on employment in the next period. Or if the effect of labor productivity is larger than any positive effect on aggregate outputs, we still have declining employment. Okay, we basically also examined the impact of public social infrastructure investment on aggregate outputs. We this time checked the direct effect of share of public social infrastructure investment over GDP on aggregate output and its effect on the rest of output in the rest of the economy, and find the impact of this over the short run on aggregate output. Again, we examined the impact on different components of GDP. And next, we also examined the medium run effect of public social infrastructure investment on aggregate output, which we basically, again, checked the impact on separate components of lagged impact of public social infrastructure on different components of GDP multiplied by the multiplier. Well, the impact of the rise in public social expenditures on aggregate output might come from different mechanisms. Well, public social expenditures, first of all, generate employment in the social sector, which would have a positive effect on consumption. Of course, once public social expenditure generates on employment, this would also have a positive effect on output. Well, okay, in the short run, the effects of public social expenditures will be through different mechanisms. First of all, it will have a positive effect, direct effect on aggregate output, aggregate demand, since you push public social infrastructure investments, this is going to push aggregate out directly, but there will be people employed in public social sector, which is going to have also positive effect on aggregate demand. But there might be some crowding out effects due to rising interest or capitalists increasing constraints on access to credit. Over the medium run, the impact of increase in public social infrastructure investments might be due to several mechanisms, mainly through labor productivity and public indebtedness. Well, higher share of public expenditures in GDP would push aggregate output, would have positive effect on labor productivity due to the increasing returns to scale, due to the Verdun effect. But it would have also positive effect on labor productivity through investing education, healthcare, care sector. But higher public social expenditures, since it increases public indebtedness in the short run, this public indebtedness might be transmitted to the next period. And the effect of that's coming through labor productivity and public indebtedness will mainly determine the effect on the aggregate output in the next period, basically. When we look at the effect of public social infrastructure investment on total employment in the short and the medium run, higher public social expenditures basically will generate employment. More teachers, more nurses, more care workers will be hired, and it will generate employment greater in most countries for female workers than male workers. It will have an effect, of course, on public indebtedness and labor productivity, which in total will affect aggregate output. Well, the effects coming through labor productivity and aggregate output will determine how public social expenditures will affect total employment in the next period. If the positive effects on aggregate output are greater than the effects on labor productivity, there will be employment generated. If the labor productivity's positive effects is greater than effects on the aggregate output, there will be a decline in total employment. Okay, so here, let me just check this. Okay, here what we do next is there are many parameters, basically, that determines the impact of different shocks that we are giving. But to be able to understand which parameter is bigger, we're going to do econometric estimations and use these parameters that we found through the econometric estimations for our simulations. Okay. What we have done is we estimated in the latest paper that's forthcoming in Feminist Economics the impact of different variables on consumption, investment, exports and imports, and productivity. In the paper that we previously assigned for this reading, we also have wealth included, and by using mainly time series techniques, we basically estimated these parameters, like error correction model is used for estimating different variables' effect on private investments and imports. We use OLS indifferences for exports and consumption. For consumption, we use SUR model. And for productivity, we use sectoral estimation, panel fixed effects model. I will get back to that, but in this model that we cover for this course, which doesn't include wealth, we basically estimated by GMM-IV regressions. For instance, we use instruments for profits, female and male wage bills, and we use lag differences of gender pay gaps, taxes on profits and wages, gender employment gaps, world GDP, and logarithm of strike days as a share of employment, as a bargaining instrument. And we estimated both the effect of profits and wage bills, and by using the coefficients, we find the marginal propensity to consume for female and male wages and profits for men and women. As you could see, the ranking goes as for the rest of the for expenditures in N. That excludes the private expenditures on social sector. We see that the female workers in the UK, marginal propensity to consume is larger than male workers. It's much larger than the marginal propensity to consume for profit, out of profits. In terms of expenditures in the social sector, as the previous empirical models done in other work estimate, women are more tempted to, and especially female workers are more tempted to spend greater share of their income for social expenditures than male workers, and the differences are a bit significant. And the marginal propensity to consume in social expenditures is the smallest for the profit earners. We also estimated the impact of profits, output, and debt over GDP. We find that profit share has a direct positive effect on private investment, but output has also a very strong effect on private investment. We again use GMM-IV in here by using different instruments, but OLS results are also very similar to the GMM-IVs. And we find some crowding out effect, meaning that the rise in GDP per capita, debt over GDP, reduces the investments. We also estimated for simulations the impact of profit share on exports and imports, again by GMM-IV, and we basically found the profit shares affect exports positively and imports negatively. And we said that the output in the rest of the economy increases the imports too. For labor productivity, what we have done is we basically do the panel data estimation by using 18 sectors. And we use 5-year overlapping averages of our explanatory variables, and we made some simplifications. We estimated the impact of output, investment over employment, wages, gender pay gaps, social expenditures, both private and public, per capita, and other government expenditures per capita are estimated. And by using we again use GMMIV and OLS regressions, and by using our parameters, we basically simulated our model. We gave different shocks. First of all, we gave a shock like what would happen if we increase the male and female wages by 1%, both male and female wages by 1%. We looked at the impact on GDP. We find that actually UK is a wage-led economy, so higher wages increases the GDP, but the effects are very little. Like it's like increasing GDP much lower amounts compared to the effects on public social infrastructure. These are percentage changes, so the effects in the medium run is just like 0.04%. If we reduce the gender pay gaps in the rest of the economy, again, we find that there's positive effect on GDP, which is very small. The effects on employment are also estimated. We mainly find the increasing wages increase the employment in the short run, but reduces it in the medium run due to rising productivity. And we also examined the impact of gender pay gaps and rising wages for female and male workers. And we examined overall the impact of 2% increase in female wages and 1% increase in male wages by closing gender pay gaps by 1%, both in the H and N sector, and looked at the employment effects and the effects on debt over GDP too. Next, we examined the impact of public spending on social infrastructure to see that whether the positive effects through productivity are larger or smaller than possible crowding out effects. We actually found that public social infrastructure expenditures increases GDP significantly, almost by 6% in the short run and 4.5% in the medium run. This is the impact of changing the share of GDP of public social expenditure by 1 percentage point. So maybe, let's say, like increasing the public social expenditure share in GDP from 20 to 21%, for instance. And the effects on employment as expected are much larger for female workers than male workers. The effects are positive, smaller in the medium run due to rising productivity effects of public social expenditures. But we actually find that the effects both in the short run and medium run are much bigger for female workers. And this is something that we were expecting, because as we examined in the beginning of the course, the public social expenditures or any sort of kind of like employment generated in social sector is much larger for female workers. In our paper, before finishing, I'll get back to how this model is extended through wealth. We basically define the wealth of, in the paper that we assigned for this session, we basically extended the wealth, the consumption investment functions by including the wealth of top 1% and top 99% along with the wages and profits. The consumers consume out of wealth both in H and N sector, and investments are also dependent on wealth of top 1% and top 99%. The debt is dependent on wealth too, because we included the wealth taxes, and we said that the wealth is dependent on wages and profits and wealth in the previous year. The wealth shares of top 1% is dependent on profit share and the wages, gender pay gaps, and wealth tax, we said. And of course, the wealth of top 1% and 99% is a function of total wealth and the share of wealth. Later, we estimated our parameters by including wealth into our estimations to wealth of 99% and top 1% and wealth of private top 1% and 99% in the private investment equations. This is again for the UK, and we estimated the determinants of private net wealth. We estimated the determinants of private wealth concentration, and we simulated, again, similar to the previous paper. And the effects are actually, when we included wealth, are very similar. Again, we find that there's smaller but positive effects of rising male and female wages, reducing gender pay gaps. And the effects are much larger when we check the public social infrastructure investments. So it's different econometric techniques, wealth included, but the effects for the UK are not too different. We also have one last paper where we don't make simulation, we rather did a bar model by including 6 variables, because and this is for Korea, the effects of public social infrastructure and gender inequality on output and employment. The case of South Korea is the name of the paper. And we only focus on effects on non-agriculture sector, because Korea was a country that has significant structural transformation, and this applies to all developing economies, which means that the women who were employed as unpaid family workers in the agriculture sector moved to urban sector, which temporarily might reduce the female employment, and this due to decline in the unpaid family workers might actually create a bias on the employment values. We didn't want to have this bias, so we focused in this paper only on non-agricultural sector. And honestly, if you are planning to apply your framework to developing economies, and I know that there's a lot of people coming from developing economies here, I would strongly recommend you to focus only on a non-agricultural sector. Otherwise, you will have a bias due to declining unpaid family workers. And this is what we have done. And the VAR model and the S-VAR model that we framed, which also allowed us to endogenize the wages, which we are not doing in the original model due to simplification. In the SVAR model, the wages are dependent on the lagged effects of all variables and contemporaneous effects of employment. And the effects that we found for Korea are also similar, very positive effect of social expenditures. And we find that Korea is wage-led and gender equality-led country. But the effects of closing gender pay gaps is again positive, but very small. But in the short run, we also estimated, which is something expected, the public social expenditures is having a much larger effect on female workers than male workers, since more jobs are generated for female workers, which basically, with the rising productivity, both male and female workers benefited from the rise in public social expenditures. Okay, folks, so I think I'm going to finish the lecture today. I hope you enjoyed it. We are going to discuss this next week. Hope you enjoyed this session, and looking forward to see you next week for your questions and comments and your ideas. I hope this was useful for you, and see you next week. Bye-bye.